Welcome to Cyber Leaders with me, Ciaran Martin.
And me, James Lyne. Now, we're both from the SANS Institute who are kindly backing this podcast. I myself am a techie or a massive geek that spent my life chasing cyber criminals around the internet.
I'm not a techie, but I also chased cyber criminals and other baddies around the internet in charge of operations and cybersecurity policy in government, and I set up the National Cybersecurity Centre. And together, James and I are trying to unpack the wild world of tech security and all the complicated things that it involves.
That's right, Ciaran. This podcast is a voice for security leaders. We want CISOs, security directors, and beyond to build up their knowledge of what works, what doesn't, and ultimately secure their organizations more comprehensively and quickly, whilst ideally making life a little bit harder for cyber criminals on the way.
And we're so grateful to everyone who's listened to the episodes of our first season, the people who've sent us nice messages on social media and directly. It's been absolutely fantastic, but I have some news. This is the final episode of our first season.
No! That was very much like a Star Trek Khan no. Anyway, carry on.
Yes, you are a massive geek in so many, many ways. So it is the end. We've had such a great time since we started. And so today we are going to look back, but we'll also look forward.
Indeed we are. Well, look, we've had a great time doing season one. Some incredible guests. Onwards. Now, our first episodes were broadcast at the end of 2024. And by my maths, it's now 2025. It's January, isn't it, James? You are so perceptive, Ciaran. No off by one errors or math problems or exploits today. So look, I guess if it's January, it's probably not too late to be making some cyber New Year's resolutions. We're only 8.3% of the way through the year.
Well, sure, you and your maths, but hang on. As someone who's more of an historian by training, you cannot just start making resolutions. Those who don't understand and know their past are condemned to repeat it. Isn't that what we say in my area of study? So we have to have some careful and somber reflection of the year gone past.
The podcast season passes. I think there's a Christmas ghost thing in there somewhere, isn't there?
The ghosts of podcast past. Absolutely. I was just thinking about that. So look, let's go to the ghost of podcast past. Bit of a tongue twister. Let's go back to our very first episode.
Easy for you to say. Well, yeah, rewinding to the beginning, that was the one with Shashank Joshi, wasn't it? The defense editor of The Economist.
That's the one.
Oh, now, aside from being a brilliant episode and a fantastic interviewee, what made you think of that, Ciaran?
Well, he talked a lot about the geopolitics of cyber, how cyber fits into all these other tensions in the world and all these other ways where the great powers of the world compete and contest with each other. And at the end of last year, that became really noisy in the United States and the rest of the West.
Yeah, I'm guessing you're talking about China and those cyber operations with various flavors of typhoons, which of course were noisy in the start of the year, got noisier in the middle of the year, and then had revelations at the end of the year. So, Ciaran, tell us about those typhoons, would you?
Well, I will tell you about the typhoons on one condition, that you do stop me, because otherwise I'm going to go on a Fidel Castro Mayday-style monologue about this, and I'll have to be stopped.
I quite want to hear that. I hope you're going to do the accent too, but I'm going to set a timer just in case. Not a 30-second time. You can have longer than that, but lay it on us, Ciaran.
Okay, where do we start? Our industry has this mostly endearing, if eccentric, habit of giving cyber actors and cyber operations these stupid names. And it's fine to laugh about bears and kittens and pandas and all of this stuff, but occasionally it's a problem. So we have these two things that were talked about a lot in the US at the end of last year, and they're called Volt and Salt Typhoon. And even people steeped in cybersecurity, some of them, not all of them, but some of them are going, what on earth is that about? And Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon sound the same. There's only 2 letters of difference between them, but they're profoundly different and they're both really significant. Now then, why? There was a brilliant article in the Wall Street Journal recently about this. China has always been a sort of thief and a spy, but it's never really been a strategic sort of disruptor. It's never done what Russia has done. In fact, the Wall Street Journal likened it to a noisy, drunken burglar. And that's what we've been used to. But let's start with Volt Typhoon. Volt Typhoon is nothing less than a Chinese military operation to plant digital booby traps all over American critical infrastructure, aviation, manufacturing, government, education, whole list of sectors. And our government here in the UK and the rest of the Five Eyes all say it's likely the same here. And those booby traps are designed to be used. They're not there to spy. They're in the wrong parts of the network, and the exploits aren't designed that way. They're designed to be detonated, if you like, if there's a lot of tension over, say, Taiwan. That, I think, James, is a big, big deal.
Oh, I agree, Ciaran. It's a significant change in the operator behaviors compared to what we've been used to. Not the run and gun data collection or exploitation, but preparing for future escalations, laying down the right pivot points to be able to laterally move and to take action in the event of escalation. Pretty fascinating evolution here. And Ciaran, it's difficult, isn't it? Because we've spent a lot of this season spending time talking about how it's important not to over-egg the threat and use FUD and cyber war. Yet here we have campaigns from a well-orchestrated, well-funded, skilled and strategic nation state laying down landmines in really serious critical infrastructure.
Completely, and it's quite hard to detect. It's the so-called living off the land technique, so it looks like normal digital activity, and it's quite hard to get rid of for all sorts of reasons. But I think the way I'd square it with our discussion on FUD is that FUD is a bit like the famous story that every child knows about the boy who cries wolf. What happens at the end of the story of the boy who cries wolf? The wolf arrives. And whilst Volt Typhoon isn't the wolf arriving, it's certainly the wolf hiding in the bushes around the corner rather than not being anywhere near the place.
The wolf's thinking about a snack. He's getting hungry.
The wolf is getting hungry and is literally sniffing around. And then you've got Salt. Now, Salt Typhoon, that sounds similar, 2 letters and all that. It's profoundly different. This is the intelligence services of China. In fact, it's probably what we sometimes call a semi-state actor or contractor. And the best way of thinking about this is think back to when you and I first met and started talking about cybersecurity. It was in the heat of the Snowden disclosures.
Ah, yes.
This allegedly vast Western espionage campaign against other countries. And Salt Typhoon is nothing less than the Chinese doing a Snowden to the United States. It's the wholesale compromise for espionage purposes of their telecommunications network, their biggest telecom companies. Why does that matter? Well, you look at what the US government has advised, the guidance it's issued. It's said to the Washington elite, to the business elite and so forth, unless you've been using end-to-end encrypted messaging, assume everything else is going straight to Beijing. Again, that's a huge deal. And it's a different problem in terms of detection and mitigating it. It's all about out-of-date infrastructure and so on. This is huge.
Unbelievably so, isn't it? And has led to lots of people asking me which messaging apps that they should use at a personal level. But before we pivot off this, there's an interesting challenge when we talk about these large-scale threats that impact policy and nation-states poking one another, which is, of course, fascinating. But the average individual listening might kind of throw their arms up in the air and say, well, what can I do about that? What do I learn from this? I've got one suggestion that I'll offer.
Go on.
Just to give you a moment to think about what you might want to suggest and they can learn from this.
That would be helpful. Big question there.
Exactly. Yeah. Just solve world peace, please. My thought here is in cybersecurity, nothing happens for a long time and things happen quickly. It's very easy to take a particular threat actor's, modus operandi for granted and not reevaluate things. Lots of ideas are sticky. I mean, you remember how long it took us in fact, we might still be killing the 8-character password myth years after it should have expired. This should be a lesson that all of us needs to constantly reevaluate our threat models, the actors that are after us, our level of risk. And of course, many things will not change in cybersecurity, but when they do change, they may change in very consequential ways. Here's a great example of that. And if China can shift like this on the US, well, frankly, make sure you're thinking about that for ransomware gangs and the more mundane things that may impact your organization too. Did I buy you enough time, Ciaran?
You did, and also you made a very important point. I loved your cyber-Leninism about decades happening in weeks after nothing happening for decades.
Cyber-Leninism, sorry, Ciaran, that's another T-shirt for the podcast.
Yeah.
That's about 9 podcast T-shirts now.
Might need to be carefully designed, this one.
Ooh.
There are lessons that we all have to learn on this. And I think one of the lessons is, particularly, we've talked a little bit, we'll probably, hopefully talk about it a bit more as, the so-called barriers to entry get lower with people using things like AI techniques and so on. What the biggest baddies do sometimes becomes available to the lesser cyber operators because they can see what the vulnerabilities are. They can see what the entry points are. They can copy it without having to design it. So these whole vulnerabilities that are being shown up now in the big corporates and so on will affect lots of us in the future from, for example, the other big theme on what we might have called some of our big sort of cyber policy themes in the podcast in cybercrime, particularly the Russian-based ransomware stuff.
Yeah, that's right, Ciaran. Look, we covered that a lot in episode 3 with Jen Ellis on ransomware, didn't we? Our most popular one, actually, according to the statistics.
Oh, she was very pleased when I told her that.
Oh, I bet she was. And I bet she used approximately 7 minutes to celebrate it as well. But look, there was that magnificent conversation with Jeff White about all things cybercrime, which kind of Venn diagrammed over into this area as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, Jeff always tells people like us that we need to capture the imagination in cybersecurity with stories. So he's got stories of, the North Koreans having all these operations where they hire people to cash out ATMs all over India. He's got this wonderful story. I mean, not wonderful in that it's seriously criminal about...
Terrible, but amazing.
But amazing about money laundering in Lancashire. He's written all those fantastic books.
Well worth a read, by the way, if I do some shameless plugging on his behalf. But look, since we've spoken to Jen and Jeff, as always, as happens in this industry, there have been some significant developments on cybercrime, haven't there, Ciaran?
Yes, and I think this is significant for people in the affected countries. So if you're in Australia from now on, you'll have to report ransomware attacks because that's in the legislation. And here in the UK, there have been lots of moves. So the government has a cybersecurity and resilience bill, and a lot of the stuff about resilience, about keeping services going, is based on what's happened with ransomware. But actually, they're taking on the issue of ransom payments too. They're going to copy Australia in terms of introducing the requirement to report, and they're floating the idea it's a consultation. And people in the UK that are listening, I would encourage you to take part in that consultation. They're saying that maybe you'll have to have a license to pay criminals and so on. And actually, at a time when perhaps under the new administration in the US perhaps steps back from regulating, in Europe, the UK, Australia, some of these requirements are getting stronger. I mean, I think the most interesting one in terms of precedent, which shows you, I think, how some pretty serious governments are getting worried about the impact of cyber attacks. In Australia, as of now, the government has the right, essentially, to take control, to seize, to nationalise the response of a private company to a cyber incident. So if it's sufficiently serious, let's say it's a private health company or a private energy company, but the consequences are so serious for the public interest, the Australian government can say, yeah, I know you're a private company. I know in normal times, government doesn't have the power to tell you what to do, but we do now. So I think things are going to get really, really interesting. And for CISOs and organisational defenders who are very exposed, they're going to have to think very, very carefully about those types of duties, whether they're legally obliged to do them or not.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. This theme of personal liability, the drift of regulation that is coming, it is going to add significant clarity and significant complexity for security leaders who are listening. I think my only regret about that advice you've offered there, beaconing into the future, is the lack of Australian accent whilst doing it, which would have been a lot of fun.
I was wondering what you were going to say about your regret about my advice, but I'll give you a pass on that one.
Yeah, exactly. And the Australians are front of mind as well. As you say, they've been quite progressive here in this ransomware domain. Also, very recently, in outlawing some very tried and tested long-standing crypto implementations to push on with kind of implementation of post-quantum as well. So they've set the cat amongst the pigeons in the secure communications arena as well.
Completely. And even in the US, even if federal government policy isn't going to expand rules very much, if at all, may even roll some of them back, we've seen something we didn't talk about, but was a big issue in our community last year with, you mentioned personal liability, legal action against named individual CISOs and so forth. But the one thing, because we do need a pivot here, because we could be, as you already cautioned, falling into some FUD. Things are changing, things are getting tricky, but we are pragmatists, optimists, and we're helpers. So these problems are there to be fixed. The organizational defenders are still very exposed, but we had some good stuff in season 1. Come on, we really did have some great contributions about how to help people defend.
We did indeed, Ciaran. Look, we had 2 brilliant CISOs, Helen Rabe from the BBC and Christine Berharasko from WithSecure in Finland, who, despite all the complexity of the topics they covered, gave us a lot of great advice, pragmatic things people can actually do. And of course, we had our very own Frank Kim from SANS as well, talking about how to get the board's attention the right way.
We absolutely did. So let's start with Frank. And I wanted to ask you, because you were asking the questions with Frank, but you've been around the private sector side of the industry for way longer than I have. So you've tried various approaches. So what, in your view, works in terms of getting top leadership attention? And what did Frank tell you that you didn't already know?
You've got to say Cyber Pearl Harbor and Cyber War at least every 3 sentences.
Stop fudding. Stop fudding.
Deploy the FUD. There's another t-shirt. We're at 10. Look, I think Frank gave some wonderful level-headed advice here. And of course, there's no silver bullet. Every organization is different. But I think 3 things I'd point out from Frank's advice. First is make your discussions with leaders about the business and risk and impact, not nerdy metrics, not FUD and coloring between the lines on kind of esoteric security threats. This may sound obvious, but so many security leaders fall into this trap. You need to be talking to business leaders in terms they understand. The chief finance officer, they understand compliance risk, they understand financial risk. They've dealt with that for years. If you can map this stuff back into that language, it's much easier for them to appreciate why it matters. It's much easier for them to partner with you on that. But I think that brings me on to point 2, which is building relationships with executives outside the boardroom. And all of our CISOs and Frank had some version of a story about this. You don't want to turn up and be the person with 42 taxing complex slides that speaks for 15 minutes and then leaves. You need to build these relationships and understand the expectations of, fellow executives and the board before you get into that room. Just kind of typecasting and laying down the tracks of what you will be talking about and understanding how to be useful to them. Again, it sounds so obvious, but people don't do it. And lastly, if I get a 3 here, you haven't hit the buzzer yet.
You do.
Perhaps leveraging lessons from great cyber explainers like Jeff White. Whether it's running your talk track of a particular security incident or risk through AI and asking it to help you, make it suitable for English second language speakers, or finding a story that is more interesting than the kind of 1-page technical report. We have to make the stuff accessible if we want the business to do it with us. And that's the only way good security risk management gets done. It cannot be done as a technical exercise in a corner with kind of last-minute updates to executives when things go wrong. So a focus on clarity and storytelling and honing that communication art is critical.
Right. So Frank and now you have got us to this point where we have a much greater chance of getting the top leadership attention. And then both Helen and Christine talked about the trends in the industry, skills gaps, how things have changed, how they haven't. They've both been in a long time. So for cyber leaders, what do you think the top trends in the cybersecurity industry are now, the ones that really matter?
Well, we're looking back, we're looking forwards, aren't we? I do think a lot of the issues from 2024 carry over to 2025. There's going to be lots more ransomware and extortionware. That those threat trends are the gift that keep on giving for cyber criminals. So of course there's that. We have yet to experience the full brunt of AI. I think in many ways it kind of turned up in the headlines with this kind of, Skynet-esque, here come the Terminators type messaging. No one will have a job because AI will replace everything. And then in reality, it's both been incredibly disruptive and a bit of a damp squib at the same time. But it's starting to have an impact in cybersecurity. It's turning up in our tool chains. It's turning up much more in attacker tactics. Improving the volume and quality of phishing campaigns that cybercriminals are sending, but also providing many more opportunities for us on the defensive side. So I think a big trend here is going to be the actual rubber meets road of how AI can be useful and damaging in cybersecurity over 25 and 26. That's a delayed impact from when it was first talked about in 2024. If I could pick one other here, I'd be tempted for it to be regulation and this intersection between government and policy and how businesses make decisions about cybersecurity, as we've kind of already touched on.
Yeah.
But I feel like we snuck that one in as a 2B because we talked about it already.
We did.
So I'm going to give you a different one, which is a little bit skills-based, Ciaran.
Yeah.
And is a bit of a worry for me. It gives me some sleepless nights. So we've seen continued fragmentation of our skills map in the industry.
Yeah.
When I started, there was one type of cyber defender. We did tend to wear hoodies, admittedly, as we hid in the corner of data centers.
With ones and zeros in green in the background?
Oh, always. And occasionally a B or a C or some Roman numerals, depending on how you're feeling.
Excellent.
But, we now have hundreds of different types of professions, hundreds of different types of skills. Even in just forensics, there's network, there's traditional computer, there's mobile, there's cloud, there's all these technology trends are exploding out. Defense, forensics, pen testing, security leadership in massive ways. We're a growing profession where there's lots and lots of specialisms. And I think that's going to continue. But I have this worry.
Okay.
I was talking with someone the other day, security leader at a hardware company, about the layers and layers and layers of complexity in our modern technology. we were talking about how there's 14 layers of emulation and complex firmware as a computer turns on before it even starts running an instruction set like x86 or x64. Sorry, I'm going to get a bit nerdy, forgive me.
I'm used to it.
But by the same measure, we've got lots of people now turning up as incredibly proficient technology users who've grown up with the likes of iPads.
Right.
Where you turn it on and it just works. We have this incredible power at our fingertips, incredibly usable technology, but there are layers and layers and layers of such hard to understand tech below that. I mean, good luck being a polysec or a polytech these days, like a polymath. I mean, there's so much going on. And we have this worry that for many years, a lot of the issues we've been dealing with have been at the superficial software level in many cases. Something goes wrong, we ship an update. A lot of our security risk management has been short-termism, even if it's been, very severe. Well, we think our adversaries, as you touched on with the various typhoons, are embedding themselves in deeper, darker places in our technology stack. And I think there is a time coming where there is dissonance between some of the skills of the average security defender and what they've grown up with, the security ecosystem they've seen, versus the places attackers may operate in a society that is increasingly surrounded by technology at every level. So there's a lot of attacker opportunities, and we've got very used to dealing with some of the higher parts of the stack. So how's that for a kind of nightmare on the pillow?
It's very, very good. And you gave me more than 30 seconds to think of a response. But I can do it quickly because it reminds me, not on the podcast, but of the wonderful SANS NCSC Cyber Threat Conference in December.
Oh, that was good.
Yes. And I hosted Paul Chichester, the Director of Operations at the NCSC. And his one takeaway, we like takeaways on this podcast, his takeaway was, look, we're really getting quite good at detecting and getting rid of people in the central and the core of networks. So guess what? They're going everywhere else.
They tend to do that. They do what works.
Exactly. What matters to them, like the rest of us, is what works. Okay, so the baddies are going all over the place. Are we getting a bit fuddy again? Well, we really should probably think about wrapping this up, but we're Billy No Mates again today. So I'm going to ask you not for your 30-second takeaway, but for your 30-second cyber New Year's resolution.
Oh, I like it. This also feels like it could be T-shirt generating, which makes it extra special too.
What is it with you T-shirts?
Well, to be honest, they should be vest. But anyway, let me have a go at this. And then I think you owe me a New Year's resolution as well, Ciaran.
Oh, God, yeah. I'd rather walk into that.
You did. You can have two if you want. I mean, lots of people have lots of New Year's resolutions, which they don't stick to. But maybe give me one you will.
Okay,
for me, look, we're talking about all these opportunities for attackers, all these new technology trends, these pressures of regulation and personal liability for CISOs. There is a lot more going on in every direction than ever before for security leaders, and that's got to be stressful. It's important we talk about this stuff and evaluate it like the typhoons. The world around us has got some pretty serious threats. I think that the New Year's resolution we should all adhere to is the continued focus on being the voice of reason, focus on pragmatism, on clarity. There's too much information rolling around about how bad it could all be and esoteric potential outcomes. It's crucial we all stick to real business risk, to communicating in terms the world and business leaders can understand. I think we all need to take a page out of Jeff White's book as great cyber explainers and keep it real. That's a T-shirt, by the way.
That's very, very good. It's also, I thought I was being clever by putting you in the spot, but I actually gave you first mover advantage.
You've
taken some of what I would have said. So the New Year's resolution that I will only partially keep, I want to ban FUD, but given that we did a little bit of FUD in the first bit of this.
The margins of FUD.
Yeah.
We flirted with FUD. Also a T-shirt.
We'll keep our FUD real. To be policy geeky for a bit, my other New Year's resolution, which I do hope to keep to, is try and help organizations, whatever the legal environment, because we work in countries all over the world and people in friendly countries all over the world have to think about these things in different legal environments. We have to help them plan to contain harm. And we might talk about this another time. One of the things specifically is I think we're beginning to realize that, sometimes data security is important, but we obsess about this and we really regulate it very, very heavily. But actually, it's not as bad as when things stop working. And we need to get that interface, sorry for the jargon, but we need to get that sort of interface between security and actually being able to keep going because things will go wrong a little bit better. And we need to plan and allocate more resources to that. So getting practical ways, not just of getting that narrative out, but practical solutions to that problem, sort of really understanding harm, I think matters. So that's my cyber New Year's resolution. There we are.
I like it. And a continuation of the theme of sharing what works and what doesn't. I mean, the cyber criminals are sharing tools and practices and tricks, so we ought to do it too.
But apart from all that, we have one joint New Year's Cyber Leaders resolution to tell everybody about.
Which is to launch a t-shirt site and profit greatly from our...
No, stop it with t-shirts. No.
Okay. Go on. Yes, the most important one.
Yes. No, I am mentally listening to a drum roll. I'm not going to do a drum roll for all sorts of reasons. I'm giving this to you to announce, James. Go for it.
Okay. Well, we will be back for a second season by popular demand and mostly by threats that if we stop, people will be greatly upset, actually.
Absolutely. You may not be that surprised by the announcement, given that we've been talking about things we might be talking about in future. I do not have a future as a detective novelist, but we've been absolutely blown away by the number of downloads, by the people who've contacted us, the lovely messages. So we are going to keep going.
That's right. So look, keep listening, folks, and keep suggesting things we could cover. We are doing this to make your lives easier. So if you've got ideas for topics you'd like us to cover, things that you're worrying about, fears like me that you wake up on the pillow and concern yourself with, cyber-related, new guests, you name it, watch out on our website and our social media for when it's coming back.
I'm sure James would be willing to deal with your non-cyber-related nightmares too. You can contact him directly on that.
Well, I guess, Ciaran, that's probably where we're going to have to leave it today.
Yeah, we've already asked for feedback like we normally do at the end of a show.
Yes, but we probably should remind people how to do it.
Yeah, sure. So leave us feedback at the podcast site or by email at cyberleaderspodcast@sans.org. Tell us what you'd like to hear more of, less of, anything you like within reason.
And with that, thank you all for listening.
Yes, thank you for listening, and keep cybering into 2025.
And into season 2 of the Cyber Leaders podcast, where I will be checking if you've stuck to your New Year's resolution, Ciaran.
And I yours. So from me, Ciaran Martin.
And from me, James Line, it's goodbye for now.